Food is more than just what's on our plate. It's the places where it's grown, it's the people who grow it, and so much more. Join me, Janice Person, your host, on Grounded by the Farm every other week as we talk about the foods we love. In this episode of Grounded by the Farm, I took the most scenic drive, I think, so far on my trip, coming in through Southern Virginia, crossing the Blue Ridge Parkway, which is like one of America's most scenic drives. Every fall, people talk about it. This episode will be a little bit later, but the leaves are still brightly colored on some trees. They've fallen off of others. And we're going to be talking with a longtime friend of mine, Ryan Goodman. And Ryan, God love him, he just has to, he has this ability to, okay, I'll go with whatever. So as we sat down, I told him what I wanted to talk to him about is having farmed and ranched, working with beef cattle in so many different places around the U.S. So Ryan, why don't you tell us, I first got to know you were in college, but you're really from Arkansas originally?
Yep. So I grew up on my family's cattle ranch in Arkansas, and knowing that we were on a large special operation, definitely took advantage of that opportunity. And I had a great experience. We had a cow-calf side of the ranch, meaning the mother cows with the young calves. And then we kept ownership of those calves after the time of weaning. And so then that's kind of where you call a stockering or a backgrounding phase is the terminology in
so
cattle.
You keep both steers and okay.
Yep.
So you're going to keep raising the girls to have more babies.
Yep.
And then you also do the others to feed them and to sell them into the market?
Correct. Yep. So we would keep the females to raise and keep in the cow herd. And they would eventually become mothers about 2 years of age. And then all the males and the females that we wouldn't keep as replacements, we kept them. And so in the stockering, backgrounding phase, that's kind of like where they're growing on grass. And we had those, and then we kept ownership of those calves until the feed yard. And so that's a feed yard, feedlot, CAFO, where a lot of people, there's a lot of questions about that stage. But we kept ownership of them. We shipped them to Texas or Oklahoma panhandles and paid people out there to finish feed them until they became beef for like an IBP or a Tyson. They ended up in grocery stores and restaurants.
So how long did they stay with you before they'd go to a feedlot?
So we would wean about 7 months of age, and we would keep them anywhere from 45 to 90 days after that. And then they were ready to go on to the next phase. And then that kind of grew. That phase of the business, we started buying our neighbors' calves after they weaned their calves, and then word got around, and before you know it, we were buying 12,000 head of calves a year.
Oh my gosh.
And so when I say we were on special operation, it was not your average 40 head cow-calf operation, which is the average across the country for a farm, but we had 1,200 head of mama cows and had 12,000, stocker cattle throughout the year. And my field trip, my vacation on spring break was to drive to Amarillo, Texas. We might stop in Oklahoma City for a steak, but we drive out there and we'd look at our cattle in the feed yards. And that's kind of all that I knew as a kid. But that was definitely something different. But I knew that, like, growing up in Arkansas, that's how we did things, and that's how the feed yards looks in Texas. But after I left high school, I knew, okay, we live in a huge industry. We live in a huge country, and people do things differently. Our neighbors raise cattle differently than we do. So I kind of took it upon myself to broaden my experiences after high school. And so throughout college and after college, I've had the opportunity to work on farms and ranches everywhere from eastern Tennessee through Oklahoma, Texas, Colorado, moved up to Wyoming and Montana, ranched in the mountains on 80,000 acres, near the tree lines, and have worked in all of those different environments and worked with farmers and ranchers from Hawaii to the East Coast and everywhere in between. Yeah. And that has just been an awesome and unique opportunity that I definitely try not to take for granted. But it's been pretty unique to see how things are done on different places.
I can remember one of the earlier pieces. So you went to school at Oklahoma State, which you were also studying livestock, right?
Yep.
Animal?
Yep. So at Oklahoma State, I studied in animal science, and they allow you to drill in within that major. And so I focused on reproduction and nutrition in beef cattle.
And so that's when I met you, and you were doing a couple of different things. So at one point you had the most picturesque photos because you were working on a ranch in Wyoming. Mm-hmm. You were doing horseback in the mountains. It was absolutely gorgeous.
Yep. So I'm a big believer. Whenever I talk to college students, I said one of the best things that you can do is take an internship into something, even if it's within your industry, that you don't know. And so I took one of those summers, and I moved up to the Bighorn Mountains of Wyoming. I had never been west of Oklahoma. Like, it's still going to school there in Texas was like as far as I had been. So I moved up to Bighorn Mountains of Wyoming. I got up to the pass, and in May, there was more snow on the pass in May than I had seen my entire life. And so got up there and ranched on 80,000 acres. Got the opportunity to learn all types of irrigation for pasture and annual crops for hay forages, and got to push cattle up in the mountains. And when I'd moved up there, we didn't have any phone service, obviously. And so my parents and all the family and friends back home were like, you got to tell us what you're doing. You got to tell us what you're doing. So I'm like, well, I don't really have any way to tell you all the time, but what I started doing is on the weekends when I would have Wi-Fi service on my day off, I'd go and I'd upload a blog post. This is what we did, and there's some photos that I've got, and uploaded them to Facebook. And that's kind of where blogging and sharing everything online really started for me. That was such a unique experience because, in the Southeast, we're trying to pipe water off of fields. Like, we have plenty of moisture that falls from the skies. It's kind of a problem sometimes. Yeah. But out there, you've got to apply the water where you want things to grow.
So how much of a difference does that water make for the actual cattle? Besides the fact they're going to be thirsty and stuff, but what other ways does, moisture really impact them?
Well, I think I took it for granted in how things grow. Mm-hmm. Right? We have moisture fall from the sky, and it kind of, sometimes we have to water, irrigate the garden and things like that. But we moved out to the high mountain country of Wyoming, and we're talking 12 inches a year.
Yeah.
And most of that is snow, and a lot of that runs off. And so if we wanted to grow a hay or a forage crop, we had to irrigate it, and we had to let it grow. And you could see a line where there was no irrigation. It became sagebrush and cactus. And that's bewildering to a guy that grew up in the Mississippi River Delta.
Yeah.
I mean, that was something that was very different. But also wildlife. I mean, we had heard in the Ozarks where they released some elk, along the Buffalo River. And that was, white-tailed deer and turkey was what I knew of wildlife. But you move up in the mountains, and then you're getting close to grizzly bear country near Yellowstone, and wolves and elk, herds and herds of elk that will just demolish a fence. And that was another aspect. But then, like, public lands, I know the levee system along the rivers, that's government controlled or whatever. But out west, public lands are a massive thing. And that was like, so much of that was just completely different and new to me. And
so one of the things about moisture I was thinking of as you said that, because I never knew like muddy areas were problematic with livestock at times. So can you explain? Because I was like, what do you mean? Like, but it can introduce, like if it's in calving season and you have a lot of mud, you can actually have cows that kind of get stuck or something in some places. Have you ever worked in a place that has that kind of bad, where you have to go pull a cow out of, I guess?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there are boggy areas. So I grew up along the line between the Mississippi River Delta and the Ozark Mountains. Mm-hmm. And so we had, some foothills with a lot of rocky ground, but within that were some bio, however you want to say it. And then there was a lot of land that we leased that was between rice fields. So Arkansas is huge rice country. Yeah. And so we would rent the ground between that wasn't farmable for our cattle. And there's a lot of bog ground, a lot of boggy bottom ground that's in there. And if you get the cattle in there when it's wet, they can get buried up to their knees, to their stomachs in mud. And that can be a real problem, especially during calving. So you'll have a cow that goes out onto an island and her calf won't, cross back across the mud or the water when it floods. Mm-hmm. And that can be a real problem. Whereas in the mountains, that's not a problem outside of like the rivers or right next to the creek. And the problem is getting enough water to grow grass. And so that was definitely something that was very different. There's a huge contrast in parts of our country that, get less than 10 inches of rain a year. And then you've got problems getting enough water. And I learned in Wyoming and eventually my time in Montana and working with policy, the true meaning of whiskey's for drinking and water's for fighting. You have to allocate, here's how much water I'm going to pull out of the irrigation ditch versus, that's something I never thought about living in the Southeast.
Right. We just get so much rain. It's rain fed. We don't talk about dry land because it's rain fed.
Right. You go a week without rain and it's dry.
Yeah.
Yep.
So you're talking about Arkansas and Wyoming, and you're talking about hills in both places. Do cattle work well on flat surfaces too, or they really prefer kind of the mountains and stuff? Because I know sheep like mountains. Do cattle really even care?
There's differences, I guess, in how you manage them. So we had a lot of cattle when I was growing up on river bottom land or bayou bottom ground that were very flat and flood prone. And cattle graze really well. There's not a lot of pushing them to one side or the other. And when you get into some of that, but whereas you get in the mountain country, and with that lack of water comes a bit more fragility to the forages and the grasses.
The food sources for the animals.
Sources for the animals. So if they overgraze the forages and the grasses that are there, it can really damage the root system and it won't grow back. And then you'll end up with bare ground or weeds.
Yeah,
where there is no moisture to get everything to grow back. And then they won't always go to the top of the mountain. They like to congregate near the water. And so sometimes you have to push them farther up. And so there's definitely moving out west emphasized for me the importance of managing cattle and how you move them around different areas and how long that they're there. And the management, not only of that, but an understanding of when you're grazing cattle, you're really a grass farmer. And I'd kind of heard that term with people that were organic or niche marketing. And I'm like, oh, roll my eyes. I'm not part of that. But really getting out west where you have to manage your forages more carefully because it's not just going to regrow.
Right.
That really helped me appreciate that part of the management of farming and ranching.
Yeah. When you went from those kind of environments, you went to something really different the next stop. If I have your history right in my head, you went to like the Texas Panhandle?
Yeah. So after I graduated from Oklahoma State, I went to the Texas Panhandle. And you'll hear kind of old Westerns and talk about the XIT Ranch or the Llano Estacado, kind of rolling rough and rugged ranch country. But what I was there for was cattle feed yard.
Okay.
And so I told you I'd kind of gone and visited those and had exposure to them during high school and growing up. But during college, I took an internship with, at the time, the largest cattle feeder in the world, Cactus Feeders. And because,
why would you want to work at a place like that? Right,
exactly. But because of the relationship, and I had gone and visited and taken interest, I had built my own relationship with the people there, and they had an internship opportunity for me where I was able to work in each and every position in the feed yard. So I went I worked with the nutrition team and the cattle team. So we're reading feed bunks and how much do we feed cattle every single day. And then I worked in the feed mill. So I had the opportunity to work with every position in the feed yard.
Right.
So I got the chance to go with the feed team and the nutrition team where we got to go and determine how much feed was delivered to the cattle every day and really how much is fed them. And then I went to the feed mill where we were mixing the feed and everything that goes into that. And then work with the veterinary crew on cattle health. And it gave me a much deeper appreciation for like all the intricacies that go into feeding 45,000 head of cattle every day. And then after undergrad, I went and took that opportunity and I guess it didn't have enough and went and worked for one of the JBS Five Rivers feed yards. And by that time, they had become the largest company in the world. And so the feed yard where I was at in Dalhart, Texas, we had 60,000 head of cattle. And so we were mixing 1.5 million pounds of feed a day to feed those. And so, I'd grown up around a lot of cattle and visited those, but managing 60,000 head of cattle every single day when you go to work is quite a feat and a big learning curve.
Yeah. So I think as somebody who hadn't been around that, right? So I love driving around and seeing like 20 cows on a beautiful green pasture. We saw a bunch of them today, right? Where they're black dots on the hill, or there's Charlet, so they're white dots off on the distance or something. But the idea of working in a feed yard, I mean, the most people in the U.S. have only seen things on documentaries or whatever. And it seems that feed yard seems to be the opposite of the cattle we want, which are the pretty ones on the hill. But you're saying they're still the same cattle?
They are. And so I've written, a couple dozen, probably at least 2 dozen blog posts describing my experiences in the feed yard. And so I get a lot of questions from people finding it on Google. And one of the things that people are really surprised by is that the cattle don't live in a feed yard their entire life. That those are the cattle that you see out on the lush green pastures, that's just a segment in their life. And actually, they're very intensively managed.
Okay.
From their nutrition to their health, to their welfare, their comfort, everything that goes on there. There is a trained professional that sees them every single day. Whereas the ranch that I was on in Wyoming, we might see them once a week when they're up in the mountains. And between that time, to be honest, a wolf might have gotten that cow or that calf between that time. They had gone through a thunderstorm or a snowstorm.
Yeah.
It was in between there. So I get a lot of questions about the feed yard, but every stage in raising cattle faces its own challenges and might look a little bit different. And so cattle that are in the feed yard are there from, 100 to 180 days on average of their life that they're there. And there's a lot that goes into making sure that all of their needs are met and that they're comfortable. We get a lot of criticism for the feeding stage because one of the things, you say you might have seen the cattle as you're driving by in the feed yard, but a lot of people smell it.
I was trying to be polite.
Right. I hear there's a lot of stories online of, Interstate 5 in California where people, smell feed yards near population centers. And I was moving this summer across the country and drove by one in Nebraska that was right on the highway. And the Google reviews on Google Maps, were negative. It was people all eat beef or, it smells. And, the sarcastic response is, oh, well, the city smells too. Have you ever driven by, the city plant? But it's not always pretty and picturesque in what we're doing. But that doesn't mean that we're not taking good care of the animals and the animals aren't well cared for. Because if their needs are not met and they're not well cared for, they're not going to perform well. And so it is in our best interest to make sure that all of their needs are met in that situation.
Well, one of the things I think that always strikes me is it looks so weird to have so many cows all pushed in together, or steers, or whatever it is, right? So many cattle all in one place. And then when I see them out on the pasture or something, they're usually all in one area, with the exception of just a couple maybe. But they usually are all right up in the shade together or right at the water together. Or so they've got a herding instinct. That's part of who they are.
So cattle are herd animals, and they definitely need their space. So when they're out on the pasture and eating grass, when they get their fill, a lot of the time you'll watch their natural behaviors to all go back to near the water source or a source of shade and congregate close together, kind of where they're at. In the feed yard, it's a tighter spot. Definitely, they don't have green grass and everything, but when you look in the bunks, they have a perfectly formulated ration. Their whole dinner plate is there in the bunk for them to be able to eat. And
so what kind of things do you put on their dinner plate? Because, you think about it, we all know what their plate looks like in terms of colors. So we have proteins and we have vegetables and we have breads and starches and we have, all that stuff. So what do you need for...
what do cattle eat? That's what the question a lot of people ask. And I went to school, continued my graduate studies in nutrition, cattle nutrition, and kind of what they eat. And
that was in Tennessee.
I was in Tennessee. I never went to a volunteer football game. I had to draw a line somewhere. But
it's my home state, but I didn't go to school there. So
right. But so understanding cattle nutrition is very different. So cattle, their digestive systems are different than yours and mine.
They have multiple stomachs. I sometimes think my nephew did, but...
Yep, so they've got multiple chambers to their stomachs.
Yeah.
And they're able to take nutrients from plants in multiple different forms to get what they need.
Okay.
And so what we hear about in cattle feed yards is corn, A lot of people think corn in cattle feed yards. And it is a great source of starch and energy in the cattle diet. It's a grain that is an awesome nutrient source, and we're able to utilize that. And it makes up a good portion of their diet, but that's not all that they eat. I have a lot of people come and ask that.
Because you sometimes see meat that's sold as corn-fed beef.
Right. And
it doesn't mean they only ate corn the whole time.
Correct. It's only a portion of their diet. So another big portion of that diet would be what we would refer to as roughages, forages, so grasses, alfalfa, hay, or silage. So silage would be a wheat plant or a corn stalk, and that whole plant is taken and chopped up and ensiled. And so we put good bacteria and then wrap it up and keep the oxygen out, and it breaks down the plant cell walls where the animals are able to utilize all that. And then another big classification of things that cattle eat are what we refer to as byproducts.
Okay.
And so it's part of the plants that you and I don't eat. So you think about cotton.
My favorite.
Right? So you get the oils out of the cotton and the fibers out of the cotton, but what do we do with the rest of that plant? So cattle are able to eat that.
It's weird because it's a hull, and it's like the outside of the seed and everything, but cattle seem to like it, and they still get fiber and some oils off of that, I think.
Correct.
It's fiber.
Yeah, it's a good source of fiber. It's a good source of fats in their diet.
Yeah.
They're able to eat. Do you enjoy any liquor or beer or wine?
So we're going to get to brewer's grain.
Yeah, brewer's grain, distillers grains. That's what I did specifically my research on in graduate school was with Jack Daniel's distillers grains and cattle eating them. That's a great source of nutrition, protein, and fats in their diet, and a lot of things like that. So anything that
So it's like the grain that's been like mashed and had everything taken away from it to make the good liquors and whatever.
After we take
and
the
then
liquid
there's
off
like
of it,
this stuff left. And that stuff happens to feed cattle in a way that's really helpful to their diet.
Correct. Yep. I should have gone into
So it's not like giving them Skittles all the time.
Well, cattle eat Skittles too.
I know, but
but not in the sense that like, we're feeding them candy, but think about what's in Skittles. It's sugars.
Yeah.
So cattle take plant-based sugars, and break those down into the nutrients that they need. So people get really leery or curious about feeding cattle different plant things like bakery waste or something like that. But what we're doing is we're just taking plant-based sugars and feeding them. And I could go and nerd out on nutrition.
I'm sure you can.
How they do that. But that's kind of
We
what I
don't want to
learned
do that.
in the feed yard is we worked with cattle nutritionists to say, okay, this is what we have to feed the cattle, and understanding cattle nutrition, what would help
and what
them.
percentage of their diet should be sugars of different kind, what should be fibers.
Okay.
Yeah.
And being able to feed them what they need. And so
even when they eat Skittles, they don't just eat Skittles all day, every day.
Correct. Skittles is mixed into, corn is mixed into
like
the
trail
balance
mix.
plate. Like trail mix. Yep. And so we're able to mix that all together in a recipe for the cattle. And so that was huge in being able to do that in a cattle feed yard. Can you imagine feeding 60,000?
Yeah.
At one time? And so that was a pretty cool scenario. The other side of that was, so a lot of people may have concerns about animal health in that. And so we were talking about pen conditions. Well, the cattle have room, and the pens are big enough where every animal could lay down and not touch each other and have space between them, but they still herd up. Right? But animal health is one of those big things. So we paid a lot of attention to the pen conditions. And so pens were sloped. They were constructed where they shed water, where there wasn't standing water, standing mud. And when that did happen, we went in and cleaned the pen. And when we had a huge rainstorm, we drained it off and cleaned it and made sure that
and that's probably when it smells the worst.
That's when it smells the worst, when it gets wet. Yes, when you stir it up. But we trucked that out. We cleaned that out of the pen, made sure that they had a dry place to lay. That was really important. But then also every day, every animal was looked at by a trained, we called them cowboys, but herd health person.
Okay.
So the pen riders are riding through the pen, looking at every single animal every single day, ensuring that they are healthy. And if they're not, then they're pulled out of the pen and they go to a doctoring pen or a hospital that was treated by a crew that was trained by a veterinarian to treat them, oversight by a veterinarian.
And then you see if they're not eating right, or if they're this or that, or they've got some open
They're not
sore,
eating right, or we would
hurt their leg.
The first thing we do is, do they have a fever? Do they have a temperature?
Yeah.
What can we do to help them? And a lot of that illness is actually respiratory.
Yes.
Just like you and I get a cold.
And coronaviruses are
coronaviruses, anything like that could be an airborne virus or something like that, or a respiratory problem. That's your biggest problem. And when we're using medicines in a feed yard to treat sick animals, that'd be your biggest source of illness. And so it's just like if you mix a whole group of people together, we're going to get sick by just carrying germs across each other.
Yeah.
And so,
I'll remind people we have an interview with Mary Beth Feitz, who's a veterinarian. So we've got an interview with her, and we talked about some of that too. Mm-hmm. So if people want to listen to another one.
So that's one of those situations in the feed yard that I had to learn a lot about.
Yeah.
But then also is, I think, very well managed and often misunderstood.
Yeah. So you've also worked you worked on a ranch in Colorado, and now you're here in Virginia.
Yep.
With your fiance's family farm and working his cattle. And his name's Aaron Sheeler. Everybody shouts out to Aaron. But we were looking at it, and the differences in the environments are pretty stark. And even when he said something about moving cattle, I'm like, oh, do you get on a four-wheeler? And he's like, oh, no, we don't do that. We walk. Yep. Which I didn't realize there were areas where people walk. So those are just odd differences. I had never. How all do you move cattle then?
Right. Big difference. So like in Colorado, so after several years, and I had been ranching in Colorado and in Montana and Wyoming and big wide open ranges. And so out there, in some places we needed 40 acres to grow enough grass to feed a cow for a year.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
So we would have 14,000 acres on the ranch where I was at most recently in Colorado to feed the herd of cattle that we had. Whereas I moved here to Virginia and we're able to get, enough grass.
You can grow grass almost year round.
Almost year round. And we're able to grow grass, on 1 to 2 acres, most time about 2 acres to feed a cow for a year.
Oh,
which
wow.
kind of gives you the perspective and the difference in the amount of rainfall and grasses that we're able to grow. And so here, in 14,000 acres, I had to have a John Deere Gator to go and cover the amount of ground that I needed to be able to see the cattle, see the grass, where they were at, feed them minerals every day, versus where we're at in the Blue Ridge Mountains in Virginia and Southwest Virginia. We're moving cattle. We intensively graze, meaning we use electric fences and move them every 2 to 3 days onto new fresh pasture in small patches. And so to move that fence around and move them just one place over, we aren't using any ATVs or
you
pickups.
Just wave your arms, go that way. Go that way.
You know what? The cattle can hear the click of the reel that winds up the wire, and they know it's time to move.
Oh, wow.
Yep. They kind of get trained to that routine and are able to do that. And so it's a lot different than where I was out west. But same principles apply. You need to look at what are your resources and how do you manage them? Mm-hmm. And that's one common theme that I've been from, far out in the west, Hawaii. There's cattle in Hawaii. Did you know that?
I have actually seen a few.
Yeah, there's cattle grazing way up in the mountains in Hawaii or all the way down to the coastline. And whether you're there, the East Coast, the Mountain West, everything comes down to what are your resources and how can we best manage and utilize those resources?
Yeah.
And I mentioned earlier, I rolled my eyes. I was a little bit of a skeptic when people were talking about, well, I'm a grass farmer. But really, we're trying our best to grow grass and utilizing cows to harvest that grass, to turn it into a protein and multiple other items that we as people are able to utilize.
That makes it a nice sound and besides that, it's a tasty treat.
It is. It is definitely tasty. So, beef can sometimes get a bad rap in the negative headlines that we see online.
Yeah.
But I've tried really hard not to just say it, but to live it. And that how beef can help fuel a healthy lifestyle.
Yeah, well, and if people want to find you on social media, that's a really good plug over. You go by Beef Runner because you're an insane runner.
Absolutely, a little bit. So I was on Beef Runners where you can find me online, and a lot of people, well, how'd you find that? In fact, I was on the phone line with the customer rep in a company that had a complaint about an order they messed up, and they said, "Your email and it's Beef Runner. Tell me about that." And I'm like, well, I raise cattle, beef, and I run really long distances. It's the runner. And so,
But like crazy long. I mean, you're not like just doing little marathons.
you know, I started with a 5K in grad school. The local beer market would give us a pint of beer, you know, after the
That's
5K.
a good reason to run.
I'm good for that. And then I moved out in the mountains. And how can you not get out and explore the mountains? So I ran a half marathon near Yellowstone. That was good. And then friends talked me into running a marathon. And then the next summer I ran my first 50-mile race in the mountains of western Montana. And ever since then I've run, I think I'm over 40 ultra distance races so far in the last 5 or 6 years. And so ultra distance is 31 miles or longer. And I've run a 100-kilometer race on the Continental Divide in Idaho twice, and ran my first 100-mile race in Wisconsin in August of 2021, and it took me 21 hours. And that was quite the experience.
It sounds way easier to work with cattle than to do the run.
Well, it's definitely something that is an experience.
Yeah.
You don't often get the opportunity to experience what the lengths of your limits are these days.
How far can you push yourself and still meet it?
Yep. And so the running for me is that. And I love the trail community. We're out there on the trails and we can talk all day long while we are running, because we're out there all day long with fellow athletes, stopping at the aid stations, enjoying the food, talking about our love of public lands and the wildlife. And I often wear a shirt that has beef on it, beef, team beef, whatever it might be. And it never fails. I'm running with people from urban and suburban America, and they see that beef on my shirt and they're like, what is that about? And so then that gives me the opportunity to tell them my beef story.
Yeah.
And I grew up on a ranch. I've worked on ranches, raising cattle, and I love beef. And you know what? I probably eat beef 10 to 14 times a week. And that people are like, what? I'm like, well, I just went to the doctor and I have great blood pressure. I have great cholesterol levels. I'm like, beef doesn't have to be unhealthy.
Yeah.
When you're eating it, and it can be part of a healthy, balanced lifestyle. So I'm not only raising it, but I'm eating it and trying to show that, you know, I can grill it without all the salts, without all the frying. You know, I grew up in the South. Everything can be fried, but everything, but not everything has to be deep fried. And beef can be a really great source of nutrition. And when you are doing great feats of endurance, no matter
good
where you're
nutrition is your friend.
Good nutrition is your friend, and being able to eat beef is part of your plate in doing that. So I think that's been a unique journey as well. I've worked with a lot of registered dietitians, a lot of people in urban areas, and after we get past the shock of like, you can eat beef every day, they're like, hey, you know what? Beef takes up a quarter of my plate. And then I do have a salad. I do have vegetables, you know, and I do enjoy my food as well. And that kind of brings it all back together. And I can talk about the nutrition that we feed our cattle. And
well, since you and I both love to travel, where have you had your best steak?
My best steak.
You can give me a couple of steak places, I guess.
You know, I think my favorite steaks have not been in the fancy, nice steakhouses. Those are good. You know, the steaks that are fried up prime with the butter, you know, seared on top of them and that. But the best steaks that I've had have been in bars and mountain towns out west. It's prime rib night, and you just get to talk to people and have a conversation over it. And I love that. I'm not a huge fan.
I also just love steak on the grill in the backyard with friends or something.
Oh yeah, it's the experiences around it.
Yeah.
You know, beef is great beef. I'm not a huge fan of, you know, Wagyu beef. It's delicious in small bites. It's just not for me. Yeah. Right. But I enjoy the conversation, the experiences that you have around beef, that you're sitting around a table with friends and family and just enjoying that. And it's a big part of your plate and the meal and what fuels you for whatever your goals are.
Well, that gets us to what I had to ask you about, and we're about at time. What have I missed that I should have asked you? Is there something you're like, oh, Janice, you missed the whole big thing?
Well, we covered beef and kind of my journey in raising it across the country and how I utilize it to fuel crazy adventures. But I think one of the best parts about beef and raising cattle is the people behind it. Yeah. And the people that I've been able to work with from coast to coast and visiting farmers and ranchers of all sorts, they all have amazing stories. They all care passionately about what they do. And that's what I enjoy most about being part of this industry, and part of what I get to do for a living is get to work with the people out there. And I think that here on the podcast, you've featured so many of those voices out there that represent
there's so many great people.
And I think that that's one of the biggest things is like, no matter where you get your beef,
Yep.
at the restaurant, at the grocery store, at the local farmer's market, that there were people that were behind that. People that were raising it, people that were raising it and feeding it in a feed yard and taking care of it there, or the people that were processing it and shipping it to you. That there was a person just like you or I behind that.
It's so funny. I've eaten beef at so many different ranchers' homes or farms. And so many times they'll pull something out of their freezer that was something from their herd. And so many times they also pull out something like, well, we didn't have any steak, so I got them at the grocery.
Right.
And it's really kind of like, okay, whatever, we're all good with it. No, it's not like, oh, darn, I was really hoping I was going to get a Ryan steak.
I really love to go to Costco and look at their meat counter and say, what's on special today? Can I have a special New York strip? And get to enjoy that. And knowing that, this animal was well fed and well cared for, it wouldn't be here.
Yep.
For us to eat.
So we've already told people they can find you at Beef Runner. So it's on Twitter, Instagram,
Facebook, TikTok, beefrunner.com, Beef Runner everywhere. I've capitalized on that and made it easy for you to find.
Thanks so much, Ryan. We'll talk to you later. And everybody, don't forget, I'm going to put some photos and things up on the website. Maybe show you a little bit of what this part of Virginia is like too. So check them out on groundedbythefarm.com. We'll see you guys in 2 weeks.